Hi there, improv interview listeners. This is Margot Escott, and I'm so excited today to have a really cool person to interview. He is a college teacher, he is an attorney, he is an artist, he writes blogs and performs them on stage. He is also one of the best improvisers I know and has a long experience with the history of improvisation. He's going to talk about his experience and the history of improv comedy. Good morning, Rick.
Hey, Margot, how you doing?
I'm great.
Oh, good.
So I was just talking about David Shepard. I was looking at his movie today and how I think a lot of people don't even know who he was.
You know, the first time I became aware of David Shepard, I was in a workshop that was being conducted by Paul Sills. Paul Sills, the first director of Second City. David Shepard was the one that had the idea of improvisational theatrical performance. Mm-hmm. And he was the one who thought of the Compass Players. And his original idea was that, and then I got to know David and workshopped with him and did various things for him, you know. And by the way, I have no objectivity about these people. I love them very much. I mean, you know, like my family. And David had the idea that he wanted a form of theater that was for ordinary people, everyday people. He wanted something that was accessible. And I think that's something very true about improvisation is that really it requires talent to do it well theatrically in a way that pleases audiences, either commercially or artistically. But it doesn't require talent to do it. I mean, Viola Spolin, right, improvisation for the theater, most people know that, I guess, the Bible of improvisation. The first line is, anyone can improvise.
Right.
So he wanted an accessible theater. His original idea, of course, David, still alive, very much alive, well into his 90s now. But David is a guy that he had big dreams, wanted a different society. He you know, if you accept, like me, the propositions that all societies are evil and they can be reformed to a certain extent, David is a visionary that wants to have a good society.
Well,
so
I'm sorry to interrupt. I was going to say, as a social worker, you know, we talked about Viola, and of course, Viola Spolin worked at Hull House, the shrine for all social workers in Chicago, and the social consciousness, the starting to use theater in a socially active way, I think was one of the things I learned about David and the Compass Theater, is really taking, and that's one of the things you're doing as well, taking pertinent today's social issues and bringing them on stage in a lighthearted manner, if you will.
Right. I mean, and with the freedom to, I mean, one thing about those guys, too, is that they would be lighthearted, I think with my work, too, in a humble way. I mean, it could be lighthearted, but it could be not lighthearted, too. The main thing is to get to some sort of authenticity. And it, to me, well, just to finish that one thought about David, he would talk about, like, he wanted to go to Steel Mills and Gary at the time and have them improvise stories about their lives at lunch. You know, that never really happened. Paul Sills in the 80s, I remember he was directing in Chicago a story theater type format. It was called Tales from Ravenswood, which is a neighborhood in Chicago. So it always was about the people getting up and making a theater that was reflective of their life. It was very small d democratic in that way. Of course, the people that it caught on with were a bunch of intellectuals, young intellectuals at the University of Chicago. And that's how what developed into Second City, and really then maybe some of the intellectual part of it has fallen out since then in a lot of places. But what's developed into what improvisation is now. But I just noticed, like, everybody wants to improvise more than watch it, or they want to watch each other improvise. Like, I performed in the Chicago Improv Festival, and then I saw some other shows, and the place was packed. The theater, they had several stages at this place, but I knew practically everybody in this crowd, and they were all improvisers. I mean, improvisers go watch improvisers, and everybody wants to improvise, and that's what it is.
Yeah.
It's kind of more like a conversation than looking to someone to be the performer. Because I did the show that I'm doing now. I did a limited run for a few months at Second City. And I noticed, like, at the time when I was at Second City in the 80s, there was an emphasis on who the stars were that came out of Second City. And there still is. It's like the marketing thing. You walk up the steps and there's all these pictures. It's like you're in a museum
Right.
of all these famous people. But it's not the spirit that's there anymore. I mean, even I was at the tail end of, I would say, the first phase of Second City. And there were only a couple of companies. When I was in the resident company, I think there were just a couple of touring companies. And then the ETC Theater was added later.
Mm-hmm.
Now they have a ton of companies. And I was over at the Improv Olympic facility just yesterday. The place is huge. They have, like, I don't know, 6 theaters and then they have these little rooms for even more experimental stuff. I mean, the world is improvising. And this was David Shepard's vision.
Mm-hmm.
I was even talking to Kelly Leonard's a good friend of mine. He's a producer at Second City, and they have the Second City Works that works with corporate people, whatever. And Kelly wrote a book called Yes and about the applications of Second City principles to business. And I was thinking, the irony, David, who is a big socialist, I mean, it's like you talk about Hull House. I mean, it's like, at least social justice.
Right.
More than, it's kind of ironic that corporations are really embracing it, but there's a lot of corporations that realize that being human is good business,
And being real and authentic may help us be less stressed out in the long run because we're being ourselves, we're being genuine, we're not worried about others not accepting us, judging us. Those principles of improv that make us all feel like brothers and sisters when we meet up at festivals and things like that.
Yeah, yes, and in a small way. I mean, I teach at the UIC Business School, University of Illinois Chicago, and that's David's legacy too. Like, a big thing that I say that they would have said too is basically, sometimes they even joke about it. Say, you want to know what improvisation is? I just stand there and I say, okay, see and be seen. You see me, I see you. You assert your authenticity into a situation, and you're open and accepting of the other or the others in a group authenticity. That we can be assertive and vulnerable in the same moment. And that's basically improvisation. I mean, sometimes I think they have all these games and all these, two people come on, then they recede back, and then, like a Herald format or whatever. And people focus on that a lot. I don't know. I don't think that's what's important about it. I mean, who cares about these, it's like playing Twister or something. It's like, I don't know. The main thing is that you go up on stage or in the boardroom or the courtroom or wherever.
Yeah.
Classroom. Therapist, in the therapist's office, wherever it is. And that's what you do. You just show up. So that's of course they were geniuses because genius to, guess it's a cliche, but I think it's true. Geniuses simplify things. And I think that's what they did. It's like Viola Spolin, like, created, it's not a system, I'm trying to think of the word, but created a structure. which I think eventually would fall away. I mean, you need those exercises to get your focus on different things, but eventually, after you do it for a while, you don't think about those exercises, you just do it. Shepard was like the visionary, with the community mindedness. Paul Sills was the artist. Mm-hmm. It's like funny. Paul Sills, it's like anyone can improvise, but Paul Sills said, and of course he had years and years of experience of doing these workshops. Mm-hmm. He said, anybody can do a good improvised scene once. I mean, you can catch lightning in a bottle, or they can do it occasionally. That it's the person who's really talented who can be consistently good at it. Of course, he was looking at it from the standpoint of, he got a Tony Award. So he was looking at it from the standpoint of something that would work artistically and even not so much commercially with him, but artistically on a stage. So I think Sills was the artist. And David was the visionary. I'm really oversimplifying, so this isn't an act of genius, but this is like a thumbnail. Bernie Sahlins, who I think started out kind of in the background and was more the business guy, and who ended up being the guy who really not took over, but I mean, he ended up being the one that sustained Second City and was really its guiding light for many years. And I think at first, I can't really speak to this. He might have been dismissed a little bit as more like, the accountant instead of the creative. Mm-hmm. I mean, but he was a creative in the sense that Bernie, if there's any cachet about a kind of intellectualism, and I think that's too much of a word for what it is. But a reference level or an intelligence is a better word, that I think Bernie had a lot to do with that. Because when he directed, when I was there, he didn't go as far as I would have gone, but of course he was trying to make money in a theater.
Right.
I mean, I just wanted to shoot my mouth off. He had to keep the place open. But, he would say, well, there's a floor to what we would do. So he would allow things, but he wanted it to be smart. And I think in terms of comedy, that's what happened in the late 50s, not only with the Compass Players, but that's when, the kind of the Catskills comedian and the bottle of seltzer water and the funny faces and everything turned over to like Nichols and May and Bob Newhart and Mort Saul and Woody Allen and all those people.
I was looking at the original, the people who were the celebs out of Compass, like the ones you just mentioned. They really changed comedy. Lane May, Mike Nichols, and Shelley Berman doing the telephone routine.
Oh yeah.
And just the brilliance, and they were improvisers and brilliant and actors.
And it's really interesting that you had actors because. I never can get away from the semi-controversial comment. I mean, I think improvisation can become a trap in that it's a real necessary part of creativity, and it's perfectly fine on its own. But you also can go further than that and add things. Like improvisation to me is basically the brainstorming part of writing. Mm-hmm. And or performing or any creativity, where it really encourages that part of no self-censorship and just let everything out.
Right.
But then to be able to go back and shape it and say this belongs here and that belongs there, and sort of like the Dionysus and whatever is it Apollo? Whoever the classical god is, it's like jazz music and classical music, and great stuff has qualities of both, I think.
Well, a lot of the best jazz musicians I'm thinking about were classically trained artists before they were able to riff off of themes from Bach and Brahms. So,
and even if they're working spontaneously, they find a structure.
Yeah,
and it's just like a classical artist. a great one is going to find feeling, even in a very structured presentation. It's not going to be the same every time. So I think that Sills and Shepard and Bernie. I mean, they truly understood this. Yeah.
So, what got you kind of hooked in the first place? What happened with your personal experience?
Well, I mean, if you go way back,
Way back, Rick.
I'm going to go way back to where to when I was a little kid. There was an actress on TV commercials that I always noticed. I mean, I was a little kid. It wasn't like on a level of attraction or anything like that. You know, like in Close Encounters where Richard Dreyfuss is piling up the mashed potatoes. It's like the Mesa and wherever it was, Wyoming. I always would notice her. I always thought about her. I always was drawn to those commercials. Ridiculous. Something I would never watch. She's selling furniture polish or something. Well, she was Mina Kolb, who was in the original Compass. And then when I was in college, they still do this Keenan review. Me and this other guy started this variety review. Well, even before that, in high school, I used to do a character called Rocky Canute. That I was in a Jesuit high school, all boys. Uh-huh. So I was like the cheerleading squad. And I was a comedian. And I stole Rocky Canute from Bullwinkle. I did that. So I was always drawn to it, and I was going to law school, and I decided I wanted to be an improviser, and I took a leave of absence, and I just took every improv workshop in. So I was right out of college, so whatever, I was like 21 or something. At that time, it wasn't the Second City Conservatory and I.O., and it wasn't all these levels, but they were all the masters that were just around town, you know. So I took Del Close, and I took Josephine Forsberg, and I took Sheldon Patinkin, and I got hooked up with these guys in the reification company. These guys, Tom Tully and Danny Breen, were teaching over at the Victory Gardens Theater. And we got to like each other, and I started working with their company. And then that was a time, which I think was something relatively new, where there were these little groups like the Reification Company, and I was more in an offshoot called the Blue Moon Players. But we worked at these little dive clubs. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And Bernie cast us. The others, like Danny, this guy Rob Riley, who was great. He was in the Reification Company. Noni Newton and Danny Breen and Mary Gross. All these people, they got hired. And they were a little bit older than me, just a little bit. Mm-hmm. But then a couple years later, or maybe even just a year later, I got hired into the touring company. And it sort of happened that way. I mean, it kind of just happened.
That's great. So tell me a little bit about your experience with Del Close, because I've gone to the Del Close Marathon in New York City for a few years, and it's the deity of Del Close, if you will. But I wonder what and I have a colleague who also studied with Del, and I just wondered what your experience was.
You know, I didn't connect with him as much as I did with Paul Sills.
Okay.
So, you know, with Del, he actually it was a combination quit and was fired when I was in the company at Second City. Okay. He'd come in, and I think that it was about, and subsequently he started Improv Olympic. And I remember he and Bernie would have arguments about improvisation being a performance form in and of itself. And Bernie said improvisation only is a way of generating material. So we would improvise in the improv sets with an eye towards generating the scenes for the next review we were going to do.
Mm-hmm.
Del thought, of course, you know, he did the Herald and everything. He thought that it should all be out there. At first, Del, and I think this is part of what got him fired, and other people might have other perspectives and be able to fill in this more. I don't know all the details. I just know it from my point of view. So I'm just a witness. I'm not really a historian here. What happened was that I was new in the company, and Del initially really liked what I did because I was very raw as a performer. I mean, I was relatively new, but I was pretty smart, and I was aggressive in scenes. So I remember once Del came backstage, and Del wanted to get rid of a lot of actors. And he wanted to build a company. He wanted to keep a couple of us, and the couple of us that he wanted to keep were the brand new people. He wanted to get rid of all these actors. And some of these actors were friends of mine and good. Mm-hmm. I mean, you know. So he said, well, he said, I remember once he said, I love what you do with this scene, you know. So it was like you beat the other players like a rented mule. And, you know, like I was really aggressive and in the scene, and whatever the scene was about, he thought like I was just blowing him off the stage with references, and I just was being very assertive and aggressive, and he liked that. And I was like, I don't know if I want to beat him like a rented mule. I mean, you know, and then he I think he lost his enthusiasm for me because I was just passive about the whole thing about what he was. I was just happy trying to just stay in the company myself, and I didn't, you know, and probably, I mean, on the inside, I didn't like all that tumult. I didn't think it wasn't fair, and so
that kind of promotes some competition, doesn't it? And judgment and all that stuff we try to avoid, or
yeah, I think so. I mean, and I'm not saying that's all of Del, because it isn't. Because when I was in his workshops, he did some really brilliant stuff, mm-hmm. and he could see, you know, he was really smart, but it was a little bit too much of the. Boy, I'm going to get in trouble saying this stuff, but I'll just be honest with you. I mean, when Gilda Radner died, I remember I was talking to him. We were standing at some bar waiting at Cross Currents, that doesn't exist anymore, waiting to see some improv show or whatever. And Gilda Radner just died, and he said, "Hey, you know what? I mean, this is getting more play than the Beatles," which was kind of true, maybe, because Saturday Night Live at that point was really this. Right. It was they were a huge cultural phenomenon, probably of the magnitude of the Beatles. I guess. I think that was the first time I ever thought of it that way, but yeah. So, you know, and she had just died, you know. Uh-huh. And I had in one of my first shows, this is where I was different. I mean, I did a piece in one of my Rick shows. There was a comparison of John Belushi's death, because Bernie sent us to New York for his memorial service. Mm-hmm. And I happened to have an elderly aunt that died, a grand aunt that died in the same couple week period. Mm-hmm. So it turned out I went back to Rochester where I grew up. I saw this old Italian lady, and just the reverence and solemnity of that. And maybe it's just me. So I don't mean this to be critical of Del or any, you know, it's subjective, but it's just me. I mean, and then it was really like the day of the locust with the Belushi funeral. I had a great time. I had too much fun for going to somebody's memorial service. I mean, and they just the crush of the fame and the money and the, you know, and Dan Aykroyd, who was very nice. I mean, they had these bars that they made their private clubs, and they had a big dinner, and all these drinks and everything. And of course, at that time, and apparently at this time too, I never got involved with it. There were all that drugs and
right,
which is just sad, you know.
well,
And I wrote something just recently about fame. I mean, I'm not against it, but I think it's a destructive thing to pursue.
right. If that's your only goal, and then where's the art in it? If you start to lose
It's
your sense of
useful.
the art, yeah,
I mean, it's like I want people to know about my show because that gives me an opportunity to do my show and audience and everything. But I wouldn't want that. And so now I'm not saying that Sills wasn't, but Sills was different though, because Sills, on the other hand, I remember when I knew him in New York, and I actually had problems later. I was too disconnected from the practical part of life. He used to tell me, he said, "You're like Thoreau." And that's true. In that period of my life, that's why sometimes, you know, like I do a show or even doing an interview or teaching, being a college professor, it's like you're up there as a pillar of wisdom. You know, I hope everybody realizes it's from a long lifetime of effing up. you know, I mean, the William Blake, the road to wisdom is paved with excess. So, and I remember Sills telling me, like, I won't mention his name, but a good friend of mine, he said, who did quite well, not only commercially, but did work commercially, that he should be really proud of. Mm-hmm. This friend of mine. And Sills used to say, you see what that guy's doing? So Sills was concerned about me on that level. Right. But there's a real qualitative difference between that and what Del was saying, right? I mean, you know, be grounded and do something with your life. Don't get so spiritually connected, because Sills had a lot of that. That's why we connected. We connected on a couple of things. Sills was highly spiritual. We used to walk around New York. He'd talk about Martin Buber. That's what we talk. We'd walk around New York for 3 hours talking about I and thou. I mean, ridiculous. Not ridiculous, great. And then he also had a real strong passion for the founding fathers and the ideals of America. And I just found that to be more inspiring and interesting than whether we were getting more press if one of our luminaries died than when John Lennon died. I mean, I don't think that's particularly important to me.
Well, you were getting fed spiritually, but I want to get back to something we talked about a little bit earlier from and keeping Paul in mind as well. The idea about all the rules. Viola did this wonderful guidebook, and all the short form games, and then all the long form games develop. Personally, I really like 2-person scenes. That's what I'm kind of studying right now. I like a 2-person scene to develop character, relationship, etc. But I remember when I first read Mick Napier's book, and it was the first time I read somebody saying throw out the rules. And I'm simplifying it quite a bit. But the idea of, we learn certain techniques to be comfortable on stage, but then kind of throw it out and do something new. Does that make sense to you, or is that
I agree with that. I agree with that 100%. I think Mick is absolutely right, and Viola agreed with him too. Because at Northwestern they have archives of her papers, and I've gone up there a couple times. And there was this one thing in a journal that she had, is that she said, we forget that the spirit of improvisation is transformation. So anytime someone is very focused on rules, and it's very rule-based, and they're very dogmatic about this is the way that you improvise, you're with a bad improviser. I mean, the idea is now there's one phase, like with brand new improvisers. Personally, when I teach or whatever, and I'm with something brand new, I really force them to keep with the focus. Sometimes it's called focus. Sometimes it's called point of concentration. But whatever the focus or the point of concentration is of the scene, you want to keep them focused on that. It's just like, Picasso painted and drew naturalistically before he went to Cubism and the other forms that he did. You have to start out that way. But you can tell there is, I'm using this expression, there's a qualitative difference between somebody when they just abandon the rules and lose focus and you just have a mess, and when they keep the focus and then I've actually been quoted with this phrase. It's like, I call it the crack in the game, where sometimes if you explore and you heighten, and you explore and you heighten everything in a scene, including the structure of the scene or the game itself. And exploration and heightening thing make it transform. And then when it transforms, what you have to do is you have to go with whatever it is. So, I mean, yeah, if it's rules based.
And then if you break the rule, it's like, oh no, I made a mistake. And I know from anxiety is one of our number one mental health problems. And a lot of actors and improvisers have anxiety, but it helps fuel us. And some of us kind of suffer from low self-esteem as well. And learning improv helps us get better self-confidence, etc. That's why therapeutically it's so good. But being in a team where one's being criticized or judged or given incessant notes is very, it could be very debilitating for somebody in terms of pursuing it.
No. Yeah. The Spolin says it right on top. She says, no one teaches anybody anything,
yes.
And experience is the teacher. So improvisation is really having an openness to experience. And if you have someone who is trying to clamp down and direct the experience, they're not facilitating it right. I always feel like, they say you teach an improv workshop. Well, you don't teach an improv workshop. You kind of respond as audience. Now, Sills was often criticized. For example, he was criticized as being inarticulate. And a lot of people didn't like it because they felt like he was being judgmental. When I walked around with him in New York, he was the opposite of both of those things. He was highly articulate, and he was not judgmental. What he would do is that he would respond, he would react, he'd get personally involved. I remember once in a workshop very early on with him, I did a very broad gay character, and it was an insensitive portrayal at the time, and it was a mindlessly insensitive portrayal, and he went, you could just see he was like, comic books. And that was so great. There was another thing about Sills too. It's like he could be, because he responded in a personal way and really with equality. That's what I think people don't give him credit for. He was not a bully. He was a real teacher cannot be an authority in that sense. A teacher of anything, I don't think.
Before we got on, we were talking about some different improv groups, and there's a fellow from Improv Boston, Mike Dakota, who is probably one of the greatest teachers I've ever worked with, because his lack of judgment, his openness, and his just humility, and being a brilliant musical improvisational person. It just always floors me. I've stayed with him a couple of times. So outside of Paul Sills, has there been somebody else who's really influenced your career as we kind of start to wrap ourselves up for today?
Yeah. By the way, I know Mike. I don't know him real well, but I did the play prop retreat with him,
Uh-huh.
and I him and Dina Tolliver.
Yep.
I forget her last name. It's a hyphenated name. Yeah, they're wonderful. I mean, they're really, they're great. Trying to think, okay, who has it's. I should have prepared to think about this. Sills and Shepard are really the big ones.
Mm-hmm.
They're the ones that I indirectly I never met her, but of course looking at Alice Boland stuff was really big. I did this was a brief encounter, but I did a workshop with Barbara Harris when I was very young. It was a long time ago, and very young at improvising. I did a mirror exercise with her, which is still in my memory as like the greatest experience I ever had improvised.
Wow.
I mean, yeah, she was really phenomenal. I mean, she came out of an improv tradition. I mean, it's like I worked with. It's the only movie I ever really did, but I worked with Meryl Streep for a week, and I think Barbara Harris was like that caliber of. She was like improvisation's Meryl Streep. She was amazing, and one of the things that I really carry with me, it's something I believe in. Of course, I don't do it as well as she did, but she personified that whole thing that I believe about being very vulnerable and asserting your personality into the situation at the same time. She was, like a lot of improvisers want to dominate, and she showed how she was much more powerful than any of them.
And she was part of Compass.
She was part of Compass, and of course I wasn't there, but it's my understanding that she started out and she hung back for a long time before she would get off the back wall and really do something. And of course the brilliance of Paul Sills is that he left her up there until she did. That was another thing about him too. Maybe one of the reasons why I liked him, because he thought I was good.
That always helps.
That always helps, but I think, he saw people. I mean, he saw who they were. It's like, quite incongruously, I'm a football fan, even though I don't know how I deal with it because they're all like all the brain trauma. I don't know how I keep watching it. But a good general manager in football, they can see that this wide receiver in college, this guy's going to be a good wide receiver. They can see it before the guy actually does it. And that's what Paul Sills was. That's why he was a tremendous teacher. He could see somebody up there, and the way that he responded to the person and to the group was because he had great insight into who they actually were.
A word I like to use is essence. The essence of a person, to be able to empathize so much and be there with the other person that's just a word I like. I don't know what it means, but Rick, I got to tell you, this has been so wonderful talking to you today. I've learned so much more, and I know my listeners will too. I'm hoping that we can do another interview and talk about what you're currently doing.
I would, of course, I'd love to do that. Talk about me, I'm there.
Do you have any last words to say to beginning improvisers who might be watching us today?
Yeah, be deep. Do the deep part. Don't get trapped in the superficial stuff.
Okay.
Because really go for it and take your time and dig into it. Because then if you do go back around and you want to do like the whose line is it anyway stuff, and that's what you do, you're going to be better at that. I just saw something that a person that did all that very well, and I'm not putting it down at all.
Right.
I mean, it's entertainment. But then I just saw they participated in something that was really, really artistic. So the good artist will always be a good entertainer. The good entertainer cannot necessarily be the good artist.
I understand the distinction. And it's been very deeply motivating and wonderful to have you as my guest today, Rick. I look forward to speaking to you again, and good luck with all of the work you're doing right now.
Oh, thanks, Margot. You too. This is a wonderful thing you're doing with this.
Thanks. Okay, bye-bye for now.
Bye-bye.
Bye.